So our next speaker, we're going to keep going into the more human realm of things with Dr. Adele Diamond. So she is the Tier 1 Canada Research Chair, Professor of Developmental Cognitive Neuroscience at the University of British Columbia. She's a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and was recently listed as one of the 15 most influential neuroscientists in the world. She helped found the field of developmental cognitive neuroscience, has been continuously funded by the National Institutes of Health since the 1980s, and has over 25,000 citations. Dr. Diamond's research is at the forefront of work on how executive functions in the prefrontal cortex are affected by both biological and environmental factors. Her discoveries have improved treatment for medical disorders like PKU and ADHD, and impacted early education, improving millions of children's lives. Her many awards include an Honorary Doctorate from Ben Gurion University, the Award for Lifetime Contributions to Developmental Psychology in the Service of Science and Society, and being named a Woman of Distinction by the YWCA. Recently, she has turned her attention to the possible roles of traditional activities such as music and dance for improving executive functions, academic outcomes, and mental health. Welcome her to your time.
Okay, great, thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm going to start with a very short video.
The CDC and Kaiser Permanente discovered an exposure that dramatically increased the risk for 7 out of 10 of the leading causes of death in the United States. In high doses, it affects brain development, the immune system, hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. Folks who are exposed in very high doses have triple the lifetime risk of heart disease and lung cancer, and a 20-year difference in life expectancy. And yet doctors today are not trained in routine screening or treatment. In the words of Dr. Robert Block, the former president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today.
And adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, don't only include physical abuse or sexual abuse. They include things that are far more common, like did your parent or another adult in the household often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you? Did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special? Were your parents ever separated or divorced? Did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker, alcoholic, or used street drugs? Was a member of your household depressed or mentally ill? Or did a household member attempt suicide? These things are not that uncommon. In fact, in the study that Nadine referred to, it was a very large study, 17,000 people, most of them middle-class, college-educated white, and they still found that 2/3 of them had experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. It turns out for most things, your risk of bad outcomes isn't any worse if you've experienced only one than if you haven't experienced any. But the effect is cumulative and linear. So the more of these you'd experience, the worse outcomes are for your physical and mental health. And in their study, over 20% of the people had experienced at least 3 or more. Adverse childhood experiences have a lot of bad outcomes, and one of them is on the brain. They disrupt the brain's development, altering the structure and function. And one of the things they affect is the communication between prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. The amygdala is kind of the fire alarm of the brain. It starts screaming when there's any reason to be afraid in the environment, when there's any danger. It's warning you that you need to, fight or flee. There's something horrible that might happen. So the amygdala gets more activated whenever you see a fearful face or an angry face, because that indicates that there might be danger in the environment. So in this fMRI study, they showed people faces expressing strong emotions, happy or negative ones. And in one condition, they said which of 2 words accurately labels the emotion the face is showing. In the second condition, they said which of these 2 faces is expressing the same emotion as that face. And then there were lots of control conditions, like just look at the face, which of these two names is the right gender for that face, which of these two faces is the same gender as that face, etc. Now, in all of these conditions, when the primary face was showing fear or anger, the amygdala lit up. Only in that first condition, where you had to assign a verbal label, did amygdala activation go down. Now, in the second condition, you kind of had to figure out what the emotion was too, because you had to say which of two faces was showing the same emotion. But there's something about the explicitness of having to assign a verbal label that brings in prefrontal cortex and causes amygdala activation to go down. Having to assign a verbal label increases activation in prefrontal, and as activation in prefrontal goes up, activation in the amygdala goes down. It's as if prefrontal cortex is telling the amygdala, you can calm down. I have a handle on this. It really isn't a dangerous situation. You can relax. However, in people who've been exposed to adverse events at home growing up, their brain shows a strong positive relationship between prefrontal activation and the amygdala. So here they replicated the negative relationship that you see in people who haven't experienced adverse childhood experiences. Prefrontal activation goes up, amygdala activation goes down. But here's what you find in people who've been exposed to a lot of early life stress. And again, it doesn't have to be something as horrific as sexual abuse or physical abuse. It could be just that your parents quarreled a lot and shouted a lot at each other. And what does that mean, that positive relationship? It means prefrontal cortex is trying to do its job. It's trying to get more activated and communicate to the amygdala, but the message isn't getting through. The message is not able to calm down the amygdala. The brain becomes rewired. Prefrontal cortex becomes unable to effectively communicate with and thus calm down the amygdala. The person then stays in an anxious, hypervigilant state, easily panicked and immobilized by things that could cause anxiety. So psychological consequences of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, include things like feeling that you need to be constantly vigilant, experiencing pervasive anxiety and worry, feeling depressed, trouble feeling joy. It can be difficult to just allow yourself to feel happy when you're anxious or fearful about being disappointed or hurt. Other consequences can be having intimacy issues, afraid to let your guard down or let anyone close. For someone who's been terribly hurt, it can be extremely hard to let your guard down, to risk trusting again, to risk being hurt again. A child might be acting in the most awful manner, not because he's a terrible kid, but because he's been terribly hurt. And he's going to push you away before you have a chance to push him away. Or he's going to test you to see if you're really somebody he can feel safe with. If we see that misbehavior is coming from hurt, we can react completely differently. Victims often internalize the opinion of those who have hurt them. They've heard so often that they're good for nothing, know nothing, they're stupid, there's something wrong with them, that they're lazy, that they can come to believe that of themselves. Hurt is at the center of all addictive behaviors. Turning to drugs or alcohol is often seen as the problem, but often it's an attempt to deal with or escape from the problem. An attempt to deaden, drown out, or escape emotional pain and social pain, despondency, and feelings of hopelessness. Women who've been sexually abused often put on a lot of weight and may take less care of their appearance. Eating provides momentary pleasure and comfort, but obesity and a less attractive appearance provide a measure, often subconscious, of protection from male overtures and future abuse. If a girl or woman is very overweight, you might take seriously the possibility, and it's only a possibility, that she's been sexually abused. Teachers, psychologists, and physicians should routinely consider the possibility that a child is misbehaving, anyone is overeating, or smoking, drinking too much, using illicit drugs. It may not have too weak inhibitory control, too weak willpower. It may be that the person's doing this in response to severe stress, or in an attempt to escape the psychic pain from severe early stress or trauma. You may have noticed that when you're stressed, you can't think as clearly or exercise as good self-control. When I'm stressed, I reach for the chocolate. The core executive functions involve exactly thinking clearly and exercising good self-control. So one of the three cores is inhibitory control, self-control, focused attention, discipline. Then there's working memory, holding information in mind and being able to work with it, like being able to relate what I said to maybe something Lisa said earlier. The cognitive flexibility, to be able to see things from different perspectives, to adjust to change, to figure out new solutions, see things in a new way. And from those three core executive functions, higher order executive functions are built, like reasoning, planning, and problem solving. Executive functions refers to a variety of things that all have in common that they're what you need when going on automatic or relying on instinct or intuition would not work. It's when you have to concentrate and pay attention and work at something. Executive functions depend on the prefrontal cortex of your brain and the other neural regions with which it's interconnected. Prefrontal cortex is the newest area of the brain. That means it developed last over the course of evolution, and it develops last over the course of your life. And it's the most vulnerable area of the brain. And that means that if you're sad or stressed, lonely, or you're not physically fit, prefrontal cortex and executive functions suffer first, and they suffer the most. Stress impairs executive functions and can cause anyone to look as if you have an executive function impairment like ADHD. When you don't, you're simply stressed. So some of the kids diagnosed with ADHD probably don't have ADHD. They're probably either experiencing stress now or experienced severe stress when they were younger. Chris Locke is a developmental pediatrician who's pioneering a short 10 or 12 item questionnaire that she's hoping all pediatricians and family doctors in the province will start to use at intake, so that they can find out about the family situation of a child. Is the child under stress, or is it likely the child has experienced a lot of stress earlier? Because that makes a huge difference in how to treat the child and understand what the child's presenting with. If the child has asthma, for example, you can give the child an inhaler, and that will control the asthma, but it won't cure it. If you want to cure the asthma, often the way to do it is to reduce stress in the child's life. This is some of the neurobiological reasons why prefrontal cortex is so specifically sensitive to stress. Even mild stress dramatically increases the level of the neurotransmitter in prefrontal cortex, and it doesn't do that anywhere else in the brain. Now, prefrontal cortex needs dopamine to function, but if you flood prefrontal cortex with dopamine, now it can't work properly. There are more receptors for cortisol in prefrontal cortex than in any other region of the brain. That's true in primates, including us. If you use a rodent model, it's actually the hippocampus that has the most cortisol receptors. But in primates, it's prefrontal. Just a few weeks of stress in preparation for a major exam disrupts the functional communication between prefrontal cortex and other areas of the brain and impairs executive functions. Now, if you're an adult and it's only temporary stress, as soon as the stress is over, the communication comes back and your executive functions come back. But if you're a child, when the brain is developing and it's very severe or very, very long term, then it affects the structure of the brain. So it becomes much harder to be able to restore the functional communication. If you're stressed, you can't be the parent or teacher you want to be. If you're stressed, your children will pick up on it. It will cause them to be stressed. And if they're stressed, they're not going to be able to do as well in school. So what's the answer? Relax. You're not perfect. I'm sorry, you're going to make mistakes. You don't need to be perfect. Imperfect is not the same as worthless. Don't be so hard on yourself when you mess up. Making a mistake is not the worst thing in the world. Even the people you most respect make mistakes and have done things they regret. Everybody makes mistakes. Everybody's imperfect. You want to reduce how many children go on, often as adults many years later, to suffer from compromised immune function, cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, obesity, asthma, chronic lung disease, depression, extreme anxiety, suicide, drug addiction, alcoholism. Have children out of wedlock as teenagers, get involved in abusive relationships, and increase how many children do well in school, graduate from high school, go on to college, have a stable home in which to raise children, then reduce stress, especially the stress parents are under early in the child's life. Literally, it affects all the things that I mentioned. The most important element in terrific parenting is simply to love your child. The single greatest mitigating factor to early adversity or trauma is terrific mothering, responsive parenting by a caring, warm adult. There's a lot of research that shows that, and in fact, I'm going to show you one of the pieces of research in a minute. Now I'm giving you a prediction that we don't have the research to back yet. I don't think it has to be the mother, and I think it probably doesn't even have to be a relative. I think it could be a teacher, it could be a coach, it could be a neighbor. That's just a prediction. Maternal sensitivity and warmth can completely override the effect of early adversity on telomere length. Early stress shortens telomeres. Telomeres are the protective tips at the ends of your chromosomes. You can think of them like the plastic tips on your shoelaces. Those plastic tips keep your shoelaces from fraying, and telomeres keep chromosomes from fraying. A cell dies when its telomeres get too short. Thus, telomeres determine the lifespan of cells. Sometimes a cell might not die if its telomeres get too short. The cell might just malfunction, for example, become cancerous. So here's a graph that shows that even at 5 years of age, children exposed to 2 or more adverse experiences growing up have shorter telomeres than children exposed to none. And the difference is even greater at 10 years of age. But this study I love. These children, both bars, were exposed to the same number and same intensity of adverse early experiences. But the darker bar were lucky enough to have incredibly responsive and empathetic moms. And what you see is the early adversity has no effect on their telomere length. It does shorten the telomeres of the other kids, but it doesn't shorten it if you are lucky enough to have an incredibly responsive mom. And this is the study. What matters most in early childhood? A man named Mel Hughes in the UK got data from all over the world, every place he could, every country, all the early childhood programs. And he found that the variable that matters the most is not the number of kids, it's not the caregiver-children ratio, it's not the quality of the materials. It's not that those don't matter at all, it's just not what is most important. What's most important is the caring relationship between the adults and the children. If the children felt cared about, the program had the best results. Your caring is more important than your knowledge or skill or doing the textbook perfect thing. Sadly, many parents are so busy trying to earn money to buy the best things for their kids that they don't have time to stop and enjoy simply being with their children. That's what the children need, your time and your attention. Parenting is hard work. It's exponentially more difficult for a parent facing major stresses, such as income, food, or housing insecurity, not knowing anyone in town or having any family here, having no idea where to turn for help. A landlord who doesn't care if there's no heat or there's a lot of mold or cockroaches, an unsafe neighborhood where violence often erupts. How can we help parents to be more nurturing and responsive? Parents to be and first-time parents need training and mentoring in what makes good parenting, and education on what to expect as their children go through the different developmental stages. And we need to help parents so they have the emotional, social, and fiscal resources to be the best parent they can be. There's a program called Health Leads that addresses the social causes of poor health and the social conditions needed to remain healthy, exactly addressing reducing the kinds of stresses that many parents feel they're under. And it's now in many cities in the US, but it's not anywhere in Canada. So we're now trying to bring it to Vancouver. I wanted to also ease your concern a little bit. You may say, oh my God, I had terrible experiences growing up. I'm destined to live a shorter life. There's an enzyme called telomerase. Telomerase can rescue telomeres. So your telomeres can actually grow longer if you cease to be stressed. The telomerase can't do this when you're really stressed, but when you're not so stressed, telomerase can rescue your telomeres and grow them longer. Very little is fixed or unchangeable. Experience sculpts the brain changes throughout life. That's what neuroplasticity is. Recovery and neuroplasticity are possible throughout life. It's never too late. So all the dire things that are more probable from earlier don't have to be a prognosis for you. There's been great interest in trying to improve executive functions. There's been a lot of interest in computerized cognitive training. Computerized working memory training improves exactly the working memory skills that you train on. But the results have been very disappointing in that the benefits are so very narrow and they fade within a year or less. CogMed is the computerized method for training working memory with the most and the strongest evidence. But even here, only 1/4 of the studies find any evidence of any transfer to any other skill except exactly what you practiced in CogMed. A relatively understudied approach, mindfulness practices involving movement. That's things like Tai Chi, Taekwondo, Chinese mind-body practices, have shown the strongest results of any approach to improving executive functions. Now, often initial results often look strong, but then they don't hold up when there are more studies done. And right now, there are only 8 studies of these mindfulness movement practices. But 100% of these 8 studies have found at least suggestive evidence of executive function improvement. No other approach to improving executive functions can claim anything close to that. So we just completed a review where we looked at 12 different kinds of approaches. Mindfulness practices involving movement, 100% show at least suggestive evidence. Nothing else comes close. And this is the paper in which we report that. It's not out yet, but hopefully it'll be out in a month or 2. While training in challenging executive functions is needed for them to improve, that alone is probably not enough to achieve the best results. It's likely that indirectly supporting executive functions by lessening things that impair them, like stress and loneliness, and enhancing things that support them, like joy and physical vitality, is also needed. Young people need activities that touch their hearts and minds, inspiring them, challenging them to reach for the stars, building their self-confidence and pride. We have to care about children's emotional, social, and physical well-being if we want them to be able to problem solve, exercise self-control, or display any of the other executive functions. On the other hand, if a child is stressed, sad, lonely, or not physically fit, the very academic performance a school is trying to improve will take a hit. Thank you very much for your attention.